The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on two bills that would enhance and expand opportunities for public lands recreation. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Thank you all for attending this Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands legislative hearing on two bipartisan bills that focus on improving recreational opportunities on our shared public lands. I would also like to thank our witnesses, many of whom have traveled great distances to join us today. We're very appreciative that you're here. I'm proud to have worked with my New Mexico colleague, Senator Martin Heinrich, Subcommittee Ranking Member Curtis, and other bipartisan members of the committee to introduce H.R. 3879, the Simplifying Outdoor Access for Recreation Act, more commonly known as the SOAR Act. I'm also glad that today's hearing includes related legislation introduced by Ranking Member Bishop. H.R. 3458, the Recreation Not Red Tape Act, has similar language and goals to the SOAR Act regarding recreation permitting. That bill also includes additional provisions that would prioritize recreation on our public lands, recognize the benefits of getting outdoors for active duty service members and veterans, and promote trail maintenance efforts. As these bills move through the process, I hope we can engage with all the stakeholders to ensure a broadly supported effort. At this point, we should all be familiar with how public lands contribute to our nation's outdoor recreation economy, estimated to support 7.6 million direct jobs and $887 billion in annual consumer spending. Our public lands draw people from around the United States and the world to experience these landscapes firsthand. In public land states like New Mexico and Utah, we've experienced firsthand the challenges and opportunities of a growing demand for more outdoor recreational experiences. Whether it's an outdoor equipment manufacturer, traditional outfitters and guides, or private industries looking to provide their employees with a higher quality of life, businesses are drawn to our states by our public lands. Outdoor recreation is not just good for the bottom line. Our communities also gain the mental and physical benefits of time being spent outside. We know that recreation on public lands and waters is a major economic and public health multiplier, but high demand and complex permitting requirements stretch agency resources and create barriers to access. Although it's easy to simply characterize these challenges as red tape, my interest in these bills is to promote access for those who benefit the most from formative outdoor experiences, such as urban populations, low-income families, and underserved or at-risk communities. I look forward to hearing from all our witnesses today, but I'm also glad to have a New Mexican testifying in the subcommittee. Thank you, Mr. Baker-White. My constituent, Matt Baker-White, will be speaking about work with Cottonwood Gulch expeditions based out of Albuquerque, and along with our other witnesses, I hope we can more clearly draw the connection between these bills and the important work of broadening opportunities to access our public lands. Lastly, and at minor risk of upsetting the bipartisan support for these bills, we must recognize how climate change is impacting our ability to recreate on public lands. Back in May, this subcommittee held a hearing that explored the nexus between climate change and recreation. Witnesses testified to more seasonal uncertainty, reduced snowpack, uncharacteristic fish and wildlife migrations, and extreme heat and wildlife, all affecting their ability to hunt, fish, all affecting their ability to hunt, fish, recreate, and make a living at outdoor-dependent businesses. Although these bills are not explicitly about climate change impacts, it's important to recognize that climate change is contributing to more circumstances where permit holders are unable to utilize their permitted days or activities, and it's a changing visitation patterns on our public lands. Addressing these climate-driven concerns helps support small businesses and ensures that our land management agencies remain nimble in the face of climate uncertainty. Before I recognize the ranking member, I just want to offer a brief apology. There are several other committee hearings this morning, and I'll have to step out and testify at one down the hall. To our witnesses, I just want again to thank you for being here today and reassure you of how valuable your testimony is to our efforts. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you for convening this hearing today. We have before us 2 bills that have been crafted through extensive bipartisan collaboration. I believe that's what our constituents sent us here to do. I'm especially pleased to see the inclusion of H.R. 3879, the Simplifying Outdoor Access for Recreation Act, which is a bill that I'm very proud to have introduced with Chair Haaland. I believe this bill, along with H.R. 3458, the Recreation Not Red Tape Act, sponsored by Ranking Member Bishop, reflect the type of legislative solutions that are possible when we put aside partisan posturing and we work together. Our nation has a long and proud tradition of love for the great outdoors. Our recreation is deeply ingrained in the fabric of our nation, and our vast bounty of public lands offer an unparalleled array of recreation and sporting activities as diverse as our great nation. I have the privilege of representing Utah's 3rd Congressional District, which is home to some of the most breathtaking public lands in the country. 3 of my counties are made up of over 90% public ownership. So maintaining recreational opportunities and access to these lands is virtually important to Utahns and also for many of the visitors we host every year. Unfortunately, outdoor recreation opportunities are not easily accessible to many Americans. In recent decades, population growth and urbanization has forced millions of Americans to traverse miles of crowded highways to access these great outdoors. Moreover, recreating on our nation's public lands often requires special permits, parking passes, and payments of fees that, while important to help maintain our public lands, too often involve confusing, cumbersome, and costly processes. Both of the bills before us today will reduce the cost and complexity of recreating on federal lands. The SOAR Act provides expanded access to outdoor recreation by improving our federal outfitting and guide permitting systems. This bill increases flexibility, simplifies processes, and improves fee collection and cost recovery. The provisions contained in this bill will improve outdoor recreation opportunities for all Americans while easing unnecessary burdens and delays in the permitting process used by outfitters and guides. The SOAR is the culmination of years of stakeholder outreach and bipartisan conversations, which is reflected in the overwhelming support it has garnered from a wide spectrum of outdoor recreation and sportsmen's communities. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter of support and thanks from the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, with a coalition of 28 members representing more than 50,000 businesses from the outdoor community, addressed to myself and Ms. Haaland for working together on this bill. The second bill before us today would similarly enhance outdoor recreation opportunities and allow for more Americans to get outdoors. This bill would remove barriers to outdoor recreation, streamline the permitting processes for guides and recreationists, empower state outdoor recreation efforts, reduce burdensome costs associated with recreational permits, and hold federal agencies accountable for making outdoor recreation a priority. Outdoor recreation provides significant benefits to personal health and well-being, and is virtually important that we do everything we can to ensure ample access and opportunities for all Americans to enjoy recreating on our public lands. The 2 bills before us today will most assuredly advance that shared objective that transcends party lines. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing your testimonies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Curtis. I would like to now recognize the full committee ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes to speak to his proposal, H.R. 3458.
Thank you. That's kind of you to recognize me before I've actually had a chance to look at what I'm saying. But there are so many of you here, it doesn't make much of a difference, does it? We're here too, and we don't make that much of a difference either around this place. The bill that we have before us here, and I appreciate the witnesses that are going to be here and testifying as well, has the same, both of them have the same kind of goal. We have the outdoor recreation industry that generates like $800–900 billion in annual consumer spending a year. About 7 million jobs can be traced to these kinds of activities. with a growing number and it keeps rising, which is why it's growing, of communities that benefit from the interests. The only problem that we have with it is, unfortunately, a tendency that if somebody wants to actually participate in outdoor recreation activities, too oftentimes it requires permits and parking passes and camping fees, all of which are important to maintain the quality of the areas in which they will be recreating, but sometimes become too involved and too confusing and too complicated and basically too long for people to actually enjoy the activity of being outside and recreating. So the Recreation Not Red Tape is one of those efforts that we have been working on for several years to try and do it. As I was listening to all the debate, because I was at all of our markup, it was amazing how many bills say they are common sense bills and are bipartisan. Well, this is a common sense bill, and it is bipartisan like everything else around here. It's also bicameral. So the staff of Senator Wyden and his staff have been working with our staff for maybe 3 years now to try and come up with a bill that solves problems, that does not create concerns or fears, that recognizes the significant emphasis and significant element that recreation provides, and that we need to emphasize that without diminishing any other activities that can be used in multiple use purposes on public lands. So it's an effort to do that. I think it's a good bill. In fact, I know it's a good bill because we have been working with senators. It is unique to see a senator working. It is unique to see a senator staff working. So since they have been doing it, obviously we have cleared some hurdles that will be facing every other bill that actually goes through over to that august body in the future. This helps to alleviate also, in some small element, the backlog, because it also encourages volunteerism to make sure that these places are repaired, kept update, and that can be used to offset the cost of some of the permits and requirements that are made necessary for it. It doesn't obviously solve all of the backlog, but it does go in a way of doing that. It goes in a way of helping people who have limited amount of time, especially if you're in the military and you have a limited amount of time, to actually get through the processes so they can enjoy the outdoors for America. So that's the goal of it. It is simply to make sure that the convoluted passes, permits, and fees that have been charged in the past can be simplified and reduced to allow people to recreate sooner and more efficiently and more effectively. And it's an effort to try and make sure that we put emphasis on recreation opportunities for people on public lands without diminishing other values on the public lands at the same time. And it is, as I said, those great words, bipartisan, bicameral, and common sense, as is everything in this place. With that, I thank you for the opportunity of talking about it. I'm looking forward to what the witnesses will be saying, and I appreciate you recognizing me at this time. Yield back.
Turning to our panel, under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you so choose. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left and then red when the time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask them questions. The chair now recognizes Ms. Leah Baker, Acting Assistant Director of Resources and Planning at the Bureau of Land Management.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Curtis, Ranking Member Bishop. My name is Leah Baker. I'm the Acting Assistant Director for Resources and Planning at the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you for having me here today to testify on these two bills. These bills, which amend the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act, aim to improve the efficiency and reduce the cost of applying for and administering special recreation permits on federal lands. They also authorize single, joint, special recreation permits for multi-jurisdictional trips. The department supports the goals of both of these bills. Federal land management agencies oversee approximately 640 million surface acres, including public lands managed by the BLM, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, as well as the Forest Service. These lands host a remarkable variety of recreational opportunities. Secretary Bernhardt is improving recreational access to public lands and has issued a number of secretarial orders to this end. For example, Secretarial Order 3373 promotes improved access to public lands, and under this policy, the BLM has acquired new lands such as 13,000 acres to improve access to the Blackfoot River in Montana and 3,500 acres to improve access to the Sabinoso Wilderness area in New Mexico. Much of the changes proposed in the bills being considered today deal with special recreation permits and their associated fees. Fees collected for each permit allow the federal government to implement projects that benefit visitors, such as maintaining recreation sites. The BLM issues over 1,000 of these recreation permits each year and oversees approximately 4,600 permits at any given time. The H.R. 3458 and H.R. 3879 align with the Secretary's priority to increase access and promote recreational opportunities on public lands. We believe that these bills have the potential to address some long-standing challenges, and we look forward to working with the sponsors in the subcommittee to address a number of technical issues in the measures. Both bills authorize agencies to issue single, joint, special recreation permits for trips that cross jurisdictional boundaries of more than one federal land managing agency. When a single joint recreation permit is proposed, the bills authorize the designation of a lead agency for the permit, and the bills also authorize agencies to delegate their respective enforcement authorities to the lead agency. The department has been pursuing efforts to make recreation permitting easier, and we support efforts to improve the permitting process. Americans should be able to access and enjoy the public lands that are theirs with as much ease as possible. The department supports the goals of these provisions and would like to continue to work with the sponsors on certain modifications. The bills also provide various other authorities for agencies to improve permitting processes, such as expanded use of categorical exclusions and allowing permittees to return unused service days. Again, the department strongly supports these provisions. Other provisions of the bills, such as online and email notifications of permit opportunities and exemption of the first 50 hours of work from cost recovery, all reflect the goals of the department. And we would appreciate the opportunity to continue working with the sponsors in the subcommittee on these provisions. Lastly, the Recreation Not Red Tape Act includes provisions regarding retailing of recreation passes, encouraging veterans and service members to recreate on public lands, and expanding the use of volunteers, as Mr. Bishop said. The department supports these provisions. In conclusion, we're grateful to the subcommittee for considering legislation to make it easier for Americans to enjoy their public lands. And thank you again for having us here today to testify on these bills, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Chris French, Deputy Chief of the U.S. Forest Service.
Good morning, Mr. Chair Neguse and Ranking Member Curtis, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service to discuss our views on the Recreation Not Red Tape Act and the Simplifying Outdoor Access for Recreation Act. As I sit here today, I reflect when I first started to work for the Forest Service nearly 30 years ago. I was an entry-level recreation technician. I built a lot of trail, I cleaned a lot of campground, but more importantly, I helped connect thousands of folks to our public lands, and that is something I carry with me today. I did not ever expect or imagine that I'd be here today testifying in front of you on two bills that will greatly improve recreational access to our unparalleled recreational opportunities on the national forests and grasslands. It's an honor to be here. The Forest Service is deeply committed to connecting all Americans to the outdoors, and we value the important role played by guides, outfitters, resorts, schools, nonprofit organizations. Recreation on National Forest System lands contributes over $11 billion to the nation's gross domestic product and supports more than 148,000 full and part-time jobs, the vast majority of which are in gateway and rural communities. As you know, we administer nearly 160,000 miles of trails, the largest trail network in the nation, and we host over 60% of all ski area visits. We are proud to provide a vital respite from the fast pace of life in the form of thousands of campsites and day-use picnic areas, as well as opportunities for boating, fishing, hunting, horseback riding, cycling, and numerous other recreation opportunities. I'll keep this focused and short. USDA supports the overall goals of these bills to improve recreational access on National Forest System lands. They'll help us with our overall goal right now of getting over some of our backlog of expired special use permits that we find unacceptable. They align well with our current efforts to reform and streamline our permitting processes and removing barriers to access across National Forest lands. We support these. We look forward to working with the subcommittee and its sponsors to ensure the bills achieve their goals. And I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to provide testimony today, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I recognize our next witness, I'd like to introduce him, as he is a constituent of mine, and we're certainly lucky to have him here today, and that is Mr. Matt Wade, who serves as the Advocacy and Policy Director for the American Mountain Guides Association, which is headquartered in my district in Boulder, Colorado. He works on issues related to recreation special use permitting, facilitates stewardship projects at climbing sites, and serves as an educational resource for land managers and recreation stakeholders, and of course has wide experience, including managing outdoor programs at 2 universities and extensive work as a professional climbing and skiing guide across the country, from Maine to Washington State and back in Boulder, Colorado. And so Mr. Wade would recognize you for 30 minutes for 5 minutes, not 30 minutes. We want to have everybody here all day. We'll proceed with your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Neguse, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Matt Wade, and I'm the Advocacy and Policy Director at the American Mountain Guides Association, or AMGA. The AMGA provides training and certification for climbing instructors, mountain guides, and backcountry skiing guides across the United States. Founded in 1979, the AMGA has trained over 13,000 climbing and skiing guides who provide outdoor experiences for the public on public lands. As the American representative to the International Federation of Mountain Guide Associations, the AMGA institutes international standards for the mountain guiding profession and serves as an educational body for land managers, outdoor businesses, clubs, and other recreation stakeholders. Of additional relevance to today's hearing, our membership includes outfitters and guides who have been operating on public lands since the inception of the modern commercial recreation permitting system. We appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony on the Simplifying Outdoor Access for Recreation Act and the Recreation Not Red Tape Act. We'd like to thank Chair Haaland and the subcommittee for taking steps to advance legislation that will enhance opportunities for Americans from all walks of life to access and enjoy public lands. In particular, we believe there's a significant opportunity to improve access by modernizing the outfitter and guide permitting systems of the federal land agencies. Currently, these systems are antiquated, layered with unnecessary analysis, and they lack the tools necessary to quickly and efficiently authorize outfitting and guiding activities. The SOAR Act will make special recreation permits easier for outfitters and guides to obtain and manage, and easier for the agencies to administer. I'd like to tell you a few stories about why the bill is important. The American Alpine Institute and the American Mountain Guides Association partner to offer guide training courses for veterans. These courses can be paid for with VA benefits, and they prepare veterans for careers in the mountain guiding industry. Several courses are offered annually in the Eastern Cascade Mountains of Washington State. The courses are very popular, and there's typically a lengthy wait list for each program. However, it's presently not possible to provide more of these trainings because the Okanagan National Forest has been unable to complete the required capacity analysis, needs assessment, and environmental review that is necessary to authorize additional courses. Consequently, fewer opportunities are available for veterans to prepare for careers in the mountain guiding industry. Section 4 of the bill is written specifically to address scenarios such as this. Climbing guide services in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California provide guided climbs of highly sought-after peaks that lie on the border between Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park and the Inyo National Forest. Typically, these trips are 2 to 3 days in length, with over 95% of the trip spent on the Inyo National Forest and only a few hours spent in Sequoia Kings Canyon. Under the current system, a separate permit is required from each agency. There have been cases where a long-standing permittee of the Inyo National Forest was not able to obtain a Sequoia Kings Canyon permit, rendering most of their Inyo business inoperable. Recognizing the problem, the agencies have expressed an interest in collaborating to issue a single joint permit, but existing authorities appear to be insufficient. Section 7 of the bill will grant the authorities needed. As Congress is considering the measures in the bill that increase efficiency and improve access, We'd like to note the bill does not direct the agencies to make changes to existing carrying capacity determinations or changes to allocations between different user groups. Rather, the bill seeks to ensure that outfitters and guides are able to access existing capacity that has already been deemed appropriate for outfitting and guiding use, but which has previously been inaccessible due to administrative roadblocks. In Section 9, liability, the bill authorizes the agencies to allow special recreation permit holders to use liability waivers to the extent they are authorized by applicable state law. Presently, there's inconsistency among land management agencies and even within individual agencies on the use of liability release forms. The bill would resolve these inconsistencies. We also support the Recreation Not Red Tape Act, which contains a number of provisions beyond those enumerated in the SOAR Act that will improve access to public lands, increase agency attention to outdoor recreation, and bolster the outdoor recreation economy. The issues we are discussing today related to outfitter and guide permitting are truly bipartisan in nature. This is evidenced by the wide range of Democrats, Republicans, and outdoor industry stakeholders who support the SOAR Act. With the SOAR Act, Congress has a wonderful opportunity to come together around a set of common interests and enact change that will truly enhance the recreational benefits of public lands and empower the American people to enjoy them. Thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Robin Childs, Director of Admissions and Outreach for Bold and Gold.
And Ranking Member Curtis and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today in support of RH 3458 and RH 3879. I am the Director of Admissions and Outreach of YMCA Bold and Goals programs, Boys Outdoor Leadership Development and Girls Outdoor Leadership Development in Seattle, Washington. During the summer, we will take approximately 500 teens backpacking, camping, river rafting, sea kayaking, rock climbing, and mountaineering in some of the most beautiful places in the Pacific Northwest, providing we can get the permits. I'd like to tell you about the recent experience of 12-year-old Peter, who has lived in Washington State all his life and had never been camping or hiking. He participated in our Mount Rainier National Park trip beyond city limits, a 5-day camping and hiking adventure. On the first morning of the trip, Peter arrived at the Y to be outfitted with all the camping gear and outdoor clothing he would need to be comfortable. His group did some team building activities, then they packed up the bus and headed out to the park for a 2.5-hour drive. It had been a very busy day, flurry of activity for them. Once the group had settled down on the bus, Peter tapped one of his instructors on the shoulder, who was seated in front of him, and said, "What's Mount Rainier Park?" He knew he was camping in a park. He knew what Mount Rainier looked like, but he didn't know what everyone was talking about, Mount Rainier Park. What's Mount Rainier Park? The instructor told him about the majestic park and how he would experience the mountain up close. Just wait until you see it. Each day, Peter's sense of awe and wonder increased. He hugged the trees, amazed that he couldn't get his arms around them. He had the group take a picture circling around the trees. He asked questions about the flora and fauna. He asked if people lived out there. He asked how he could get to work out there. I always check in with the groups when they return, and knowing that this was Peter's first camping trip, I asked him how he liked it. He immediately broadly smiled. Then I asked him for a highlight. He thoughtfully said, "Getting to see that mountain up close." As I looked at him, I could tell he was experiencing it again in his mind's eye. Then he said to me, "You know, I usually drink soda and juice, but I've been drinking only water this week, and I feel a whole lot better. I think I'm going to drink more water from now on. I'm going to tell my family they need to do that too." Later, the instructors told me of the conversation on the bus and how Peter thought the trip was too short when it was time to leave. The trip is only 5 days because that's the maximum length of time we're allowed to spend in the park. My contact at his school told me of the new self-confidence he exuded and how much he appreciated the experience. He wants to visit more public lands and wild places. Without these facilitated outdoor activities, such as Bold and Goals, many of the youth of our communities would not be able to have experiences like Peter. The impact has greatly changed lifestyles, has been a pathway to careers, and provided increased awareness of the importance of stewardship of the environment. It is heartbreaking to tell disappointed youth and families that our trips are full, when I know we have the capacity to run more trips, but are unable to obtain access to public lands that we say belong to them. Our Mount Rainier trips are our most popular. However, the permitting process is one of the most difficult for us. While we have the same trip Peter did on our 2020 schedule, we are seriously considering canceling the program there due to the restrictive permitting issues. I often tell youth and caregivers who are worried about not having the proper gear and clothing, don't worry, we can provide all of that for you. The gear, the transportation, the food, tuition. If you want to go, we can make it happen. At Bold and Goal, we work diligently to remove barriers to the outdoors. Please support these acts to help us remove the biggest barrier we face, access to public lands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Childs. The chair now recognizes Mr. Matt Baker White, Acting Director of Cottonwood Gulch Expeditions. It's an absolute pleasure for me to have a fellow New Mexican here with us today, especially one who has worked tirelessly to ensure that underserved youth have the opportunity to experience and enjoy our nation's public lands. I'm excited to hear your insights and your proposals before us today and look forward to hearing more about your good work. So thank you for being here. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Haaland, Ranking Member Curtis, and members of the committee. I'm representing Cottonwood Gulch Expeditions, a 93-year-old wilderness education program based in the American Southwest. Cottonwood Gulch is a nonprofit that takes youth out on single-day trips, summer-long treks, and everything in between. Our focus is promoting personal growth while also providing opportunities for scientific, historic, and cultural discovery. Today, we operate open enrollment summer expeditions and partner with schools to create unique field-based learning experiences. Over 60% of our school programs serve Title I students in New Mexico, and over 60% of our total participants receive direct scholarship. We also have 2 federally funded initiatives, a Youth Conservation Corps, and an Every Kid Outdoors program. In the past 10 years, we have worked to engage more youth from underserved communities, especially in our home state of New Mexico. I have to admit that I'm far more comfortable wrangling a group of kids on top of a mountain than I am sitting here today. My work is primarily visiting incredible public lands with young people. With that being said, I'd like to start by telling you a story about the impact these places have on our youth. In the spring of 2014, after sharing a campfire in a traditional Dene Hogan with a group of middle schoolers from the South Valley of Albuquerque, a student walked outside and stopped dead in his tracks. I almost ran into him. He was staring up at the sky. Pinpricks of light came from millions of stars, a new moon hung on the horizon, and a hazy cloud of the Milky Way floated above. It was jaw-dropping. The student was in 7th grade, about 13 years old. He pointed up, his hand cutting through the blanket of darkness overhead, and said, "What are those? Are they stars?" I was dumbfounded and replied, "Yes, of course." He looked over his shoulder at me and then back up, even more awestruck. He stared for a moment, and then he said, "I've never seen them. My mom doesn't let me out after dark because she says it's not safe." We're here today to talk about streamlining the federal permitting processes. I'm here to tell you how that streamlining would affect real people. If these acts pass, Cottonwood Gulch would be able to reassign roughly a quarter of our administrative staff time from federal permitting towards other initiatives. This will translate directly into providing more youth and more underserved youth with meaningful outdoor education. Since our first trek in 1926, access to public lands has become more restricted, more complicated, and more expensive. We used to simply be able to pull off the side of the road, make camp for the night, and go for a hike the next day if it struck our fancy. Obviously, public lands have much higher use, managers have different responsibilities, and agencies have greater costs than they did in the early 1900s. We understand the need for regulation and permitting on public lands. These acts provide a unique opportunity to remove some of those challenges and streamline the process. Today, we work primarily with 3 federal agencies, the Forest Service, the Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. We have a full-time year-round employee whose primary role it is to submit permit applications, to report to these agencies, and to manage relationships with forests, parks, and rangers. In the past year, he has submitted over 30 different permits across these agencies. In addition, our field staff review each permit and ensure our programs are adhering to the requirements. There are 4 provisions we specifically think are most important in these acts. First, an alternative per-person fee. This provision would reduce the reporting headaches we face and the complicated fee structures. Second, the permit process improvements. This provision would ensure timely processing of permits and streamline processes overall. Third, permit flexibility. This provision would substantially reduce the number of permits required each year and will allow permits to shift and change as our programs do. And fourth, the extension of special recreation permits. This provision will ensure that long-term permits are extended beyond their expiration date when we submit the required renewal paperwork. While there are many other measures in these bills that would help our programs, we believe that the aforementioned provisions would provide the greatest changes to our day-to-day operations. In our written testimony, we provide additional details about these and other provisions which would help Cottonwood Gulch. So back to the work we do and why these bills will help us get more youth outdoors. Ultimately, the more time and resources we spend navigating a complex regulatory framework, the less time we spend outside with kids, sharing thousand-year-old cultural sites, high mountain passes, and otherworldly hoodoos. Each day my staff spends leading a hike instead of filling out government paperwork is a day well spent. Thank you for the opportunity to present on these issues.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. David Brown, Senior Consultant for the America Outdoors Association. Mr. Brown, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving America Outdoors Association the opportunity to provide testimony in support of Recreation Not Red Tape Act and the Simplifying Outdoor Access for Recreation Act. America Outdoors Association is a national nonprofit trade association representing the interests of outfitters and guiding companies, many of which operate on federally managed lands and waters under permits authorized by the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act. Our members include whitewater rafting outfitters, guest ranches, bike touring companies, canoe and kayak rental businesses, guided hiking outfitters, hunting outfitters, educational organizations providing skills training and trips for youth. We're encouraged by the bipartisanship you have demonstrated in bringing this legislation forward and by your active role in advancing recreational uses of public lands. As you know, the authority to issue outfitting guide permits for these agencies is contained in a somewhat vague provision in FLORIA, which currently sunsets October 1st, 2020. The need to reauthorize this important authority and to improve upon it are among the strongest justifications for this legislation. SOAR and R&R build on the past successes of the Recreation Special Use Permitting Program in these agencies covered by the legislation. The benefits of these programs to rural economies are significant and often overlooked. We estimate that over 14,000 permits for outfitting and guiding and special events are covered by this legislation. And I want to say these agencies have done a great job over time with these special use programs. But, you know, after a while, these programs have to be reviewed and improved, and that's what these bills are about. Over the past 40 years, the processes have become more complex and costly. They exceed the capacity of the agencies to authorize new uses, and as a result, stifle access by the segment of the public in need of services from outfitters. Even minor adjustments to existing permits to adapt to changing markets have become difficult because of the overburden of process. For the remainder of my testimony, I want to focus on what I believe are the 3 primary benefits of H.R. 3879 and give you examples of how SOAR accomplishes those values. Those benefits include improved access to public lands while maintaining protections for the environment, improvements to the permitting systems to reduce administrative costs, and simplification of permit fee calculations and cost recovery reform. Section 5 in SOAR improves access by providing more flexibility to agencies and permit holders to engage in recreation activities that are substantially similar to the activity that is specifically cited in their permit, provided it is comparable in type and does not result in greater ecological impact. For example, an outfitter authorized to offer paddle sports instruction using canoes and kayaks would also be able to use stand-up paddle boards without getting the permit amended and having to go through NEPA compliance. SOAR improves the permitting systems to reduce administrative costs by requiring agencies to evaluate permitting processes to reduce cost, processing times, and duplication. And most importantly, SOAR sets deadlines for completion of this evaluation and for changes to the regulations. Now, the agencies are engaged to some extent in this process, but this bill provides statutory authorization for those reviews and improves upon them. SOAR makes important changes to the Forest Service fee calculation policies that are cumbersome and difficult to administer. Section 3 in SOAR eliminates fees for goods and services delivered and consumed outside agency boundaries, for example. The Forest Service currently bases their permit fee on gross revenues, which by definition includes goods or services provided off National Forest System land, such as lodging and meals, delivered and consumed on private land. Section 10 removes the catch-22 in the Forest Service cost recovery rule by conforming to the intent expressed in the Forest Service's final cost recovery rule in 2006. The Forest Service recognized the potential negative economic impacts of cost recovery on small entities in publication of their final rule, but in response, the Forest Service provided an exemption for the first 50 hours or less of work, then removed that exemption when time spent exceeded 50 hours. In other words, you go back to full cost recovery for all 51 hours if you go over 50 hours, for example. Section 10 does not eliminate cost recovery, but revises the requirement to apply a 50-hour credit for each permit, not one 50-hour credit for a group of permits. Section 10 also recognizes extenuating circumstances and gives the forest supervisor the option of waiving cost recovery. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you so much, and thank all of you for your valuable testimony. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Baker White, I want to start by thanking you for traveling from New Mexico to be here today, for your detailed testimony on these bills, and most importantly, for the admirable work you're doing to get more kids outside and into our public lands, with the important focus on those who are least likely to have those opportunities. Working with Title I students, and especially those who have never been camping or hiking, presents many interesting challenges, yet your written testimony describes the federal permitting process as one of the greatest challenges you face as an organization. You provided numerous examples of how these bills would benefit Cottonwood Gulch expeditions, but I'm hoping you can help us sum up the overall effect. What could a simplified and streamlined permitting process mean for your ability to provide services and outdoor experiences for the populations you are committed to serving?
So right now, we're a relatively small organization. We have about 10,000 user days total every year. And right now we have a year-round staff of about 5 employees. And that fluctuates. In the summer, we employ about 45 full-time staff, and we have about 100 on our payroll total. Currently, a quarter or more of our full-time administrative capacity is dedicated to applying for new permits, reporting on existing permits, and doing the work of relationship building with the Forest Service, the Park Service, the BLM, et cetera. So if these bills passed, that would reduce the administrative time significantly, which would allow us to seek additional funding, write grants through new organizations, possibly expand our YCC or Every Kid Outdoors program as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Ms. Childs, I'd like to also give you a chance to share your perspective. Do you share Mr. Baker White's views that the permitting changes envisioned in these bills would enable you to serve more children?
Absolutely. We have 3 full-time staff that spend a considerable amount of time trying to navigate the permitting processes, and that time and resource could be put to developing our programming, fundraising, recruiting more staff. Bold and Goal is a national program, and there are a number of of Ys across the nation that have attempted to start bold and gold programs. Idaho, for one, they weren't able to get permits at all. Billings, Montana, took their students from Montana to Wyoming because that's where they could get the permits. And most recently, the Y in metropolitan Atlanta started the permitting process in fall and was told that they probably, fall of 2018, that they probably would be able to get a permit, and it would probably come through in July, and it's September now, and they still don't have the permit. So if the permitting process was streamlined and easier for us, we could serve more youth.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Ms. Childs, again, in your experience, what's the number one barrier or challenge to accessing federal lands through the current permitting process?
The lack of access. There are a number of places, forest lands that we would like to go to. Many of the kids are asking to learn how to fish, and where we're able to go in the North Cascades around Ross Lake, that's not an ideal place to fish. We'd like to get into the Alpine Lakes area. So we could provide more types of outdoor activities for youth if we were able to get more permits.
Thank you so much. Mr. French and Ms. Baker, on the SOAR Act, I've heard numerous accounts of permit applications being lost or simply not responded to. Instances of outfitters and guides waiting weeks or longer for timely permit approvals and permitting requirements that vary depending wildly even within the same region. Mr. French, the Forest Service has been public about their desire to improve customer service, but when it comes to recreational permitting, do you think the Forest Service is fully meeting the expectations of the outfitters, guides, and nonprofits who rely on access to federal lands?
I don't think we have, and we're working hard to change that. We administer more than 75,000 permits. Over 2/3 of those are recreation. We have a backlog every year of expired permits of 5,000 to 6,000. This has been a central focus of us in the last year, and we're working to change that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Ms. Baker, do you feel BLM is meeting the public's expectations when it comes to recreation permitting?
Thank you for the question. We don't administer the same body of permits that the Forest Service does, but we do annually have more than 4,500 permits that we're administering at any given time. And I understand, similar to Mr. French, that expectation for many of our permit holders is not being met, but through priorities, the department and the Bureau, we're working on improving that, including improved online access to permitting, et cetera.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for going over time. I will now recognize Ranking Member Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you're the chairman, so you get to take as much time as you want. I'm pleased to be here with you today. Thank you to our witnesses. Some of you have traveled a great distance. Ms. Baker, always a pleasure to have you in this room, and appreciate you being willing to answer our questions. I'd like to start with you, Mr. French, and maybe take off on a question that was just asked you about capacity. I understand since you revised your permitting process about 10 years ago, there's been an agency-wide decline in permit administration resources. Some say as much as 40%, making it even more difficult. Can you address a little bit more of the struggles and then how this bill specifically will help alleviate some of that pressure on the staff?
Yep. Thank you for the question. If you look at the agency over the last 15 years with the rising cost of suppressing fire, we have moved essentially more than 40% of our workforce away from non-fire positions towards fire positions across the board. And this has affected our capacity to deal with issues on almost anything we do, whether it's removing fuels from the forest, maintaining our campgrounds, or providing customer service for the folks that walk in the door asking us for a firewood permit or an outfitter guide permit. The backlog and the sheer number of outfitter guide and special use permits we have is tremendous. We recognize this issue. We recognize that we have to change some of our prioritizations and use our funding more effectively and more efficiently. These bills will help streamline those processes. They align well with our special uses modernization effort, which is focused on regulatory reform, technology reform, and putting more skills and capacity, training people to do this work well.
Yeah, I don't think any of us anticipate pressure coming off those fire resources and probably actually even increasing. Ms. Baker, are there any categorical exclusions used by other agencies like the Forest Service that the BLM would like to be able to use?
Mr. Curtis, we currently do have one categorical exclusion that we can utilize for special recreation permits, though it is fairly limited. It has some day caps and can't be used on all of the public lands that BLM manages. And we are always interested in other categorical exclusion opportunities that might be provided by Congress legislatively. I can't speak to a specific one within the Forest Service that we would be looking for at this time, but we're always interested.
Yeah, we'd like to keep that dialogue open, as well as you mentioned some things on this bill that could be improved. And so please know there's an open communication with my office and a desire to do that.
Thank you.
Mr. French, you on category exclusions that you would like to be using that you don't have access to?
We just finished a comment period on a series of NEPA reforms that we have put out. That included several specifically targeted at this issue and on special uses in general. We'd like to see that promulgated into a final rule. We always appreciate Congress's help on similar approaches.
Good, thank you. Mr. Brown, we're going to refer to a chart, and I'm going to ask that it get pulled up, one that you likely will recognize as a chart that you used last time you were here to demonstrate the complexities of the permitting process. I'm curious, has that become more complicated since you were here last? Is that still the same chart, or would you even add more to it? And could you just speak briefly on how these two bills will simplify that chart?
Well, the first question, the Forest Service has implemented a pre-decisional objection process for project-level decisions, such as issuing a group of permit. This is in the planning rule. It's actually a double-edged sword. It's good, but it can be, possibly complicate the process because only the objectors generally get approved to negotiate out the objections with the forest supervisor. And I think it's similar to something you folks have to deal with on the House floor, where you have to object to the bill you support to be able to testify or speak in support of it. But that's one process. Now, again, it's not doesn't always apply to every permit, but it can be a complication. One of the things that's in this chart that the bill proposes to do is eliminate the needs assessment outside of wilderness. If you are operating in designated wilderness, the Wilderness Act requires an assessment of need for commercial services to fulfill the recreational purposes of the Wilderness Act. This eliminates that process outside of wilderness. And there's some other ways that the Forest Service can determine that need, and certainly temporary permits is one way for that to occur.
Thank you. I wish we could talk more with all of you. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you. Chair reserves his time and recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker White, I think I heard you say there was like a percentage or amount of time that you spend on permit processing that your staff could save if either of these bills were to pass. Did you have a number in there that you gave us?
Yeah, so right now we spend about a quarter of our administrative time processing permits. These bills wouldn't eliminate that time entirely, but they would significantly reduce that time.
That's cool. Mr. Brown, it's good to see you again. Can you explain, you mentioned the problem of getting different kinds of permits, like if you want to go paddleboarding or kayaking. Can you just amplify what you meant by that, by the multiple permitting process you have to use that could be streamlined?
Yes, if someone is offering, for example, a canoe and kayak instruction is one of the examples, and this has actually occurred in a forest, and they wanted to, with the changing markets, there was public demand for stand-up paddleboards, but the agency said, no, your permit requires you to use canoes and kayaks. It's essentially the same type of activity a stand-up paddleboard is, but they were prohibited from using those because of the permit. And this would allow that to be added, the bill would allow that to be added without going through NEPA documentation or amendments to the permit.
Good. All right, I appreciate that explanation, and I appreciate you mentioning Faria. I hope my staff heard that. We're going to make changes in Faria. And all I have to say is GO sounds so much better than SOAR. You should have kept the same title, but other than that, let's go for it. Mr. French, let me ask you a couple of questions. The Forest Service, you just mentioned this, is going through a process of revising its NEPA regulations. And I believe predictably, like on cue, there are certain special interest groups out there that are protesting what you're doing, saying that you're changing the NEPA process is going to produce catastrophic damage to the environment. Can you just briefly explain the kind of extensive public process you're going through in this NEPA review?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Before we started rewriting the regulation, we held public meetings and workshops in all of our regions across the country. We put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking and asked folks what they thought. What were the sort of things that we should work on? What should be included? We got around 50,000 comments associated with that. We had a technical workshop with advocates in NEPA that come from all the different various groups that have a stake in this, whether they're industry groups or environmental groups. Asked them what they thought. We went through the
Maybe back
interagency
up just 1 second, though. This is not a new process. I mean, did you not start this in the prior administration?
We did, and looking at how we would reform NEPA is something that we started more than 2.5, 3 years ago. And then we put out our proposed regulation for public comment. We got around 80,000 comments with that. That just closed a few weeks ago. And we will continue to do some public outreach as we go forward doing our final regulation. So for a regulation, extensive public outreach and input to define the final goal.
All right, you've mentioned to a couple of other people, and both of you have, about the importance of categorical exclusions and how they can be helpful and useful to you. Is my assumption that if you indeed finish this regulatory review process, check all the boxes and get through the final deadline of that, and you have some flexibility that was given in either or both of these two acts, that you could use a programmatic environmental review, you could help you to adapt and incorporate material from a previous environmental impact statement so that you can use it on a new environmental impact statement, and will shrink the amount of time these guys are wasting in getting permits?
Yes, there's two key things that I'd say here is the categorical exclusions that we proposed are based on us analyzing hundreds of projects that we have done prior to this where we do full environmental assessments and sometimes EISs for this work. So we just didn't make them up. They're based on looking at all the previous work we did on this. We've also brought into this the concept of looking at that previous work and determining whether anything has changed and whether or not new NEPA is needed. And that's a determination of NEPA adequacy. We actually modeled this on what some of the work the BLM does.
So for either you, Ms. Baker, or you, Mr. French, you got 30 seconds. I'm sorry to do this to you. But what you're saying is right now it's not only the law, but also the lawsuits that are inhibiting you from actually using an expedited process of taking data that you already have and applying it to a different situation.
I'd say that briefly that a cultural concern about litigation does often create for us instances where we don't utilize fully other analyses. So having that established would be helpful.
Thank you. I'm over.
Further reserving, the chair recognizes Mr. Gomert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we do appreciate all of you being here and your input. Ms. French, as Deputy Director of the Forest Service, you happen to be the person here and available. We have national forests in the southern part of my district. And as you certainly know, when that program, when the national forests were created, it was a great agreement between local, state, and federal officials because the federal government was going to be able to manage the forest so well and manage the forest well, particularly in East Texas, since we have no sequoias, we have no redwoods, we have pine trees that grow back in 20 to 25 years, is one of America's great renewable resources, which is now going underused tremendously. But even in the 1980s, probably my most rural county, they were showing me that they were getting $1.6, $1.7 million as their 25% of the production revenue off of the national forests. And that was helpful. They divided half between the county roads and maintenance, and then the other half going to the schools. Now the counties that have national forests, particularly the more rural, they are in financial distress. The one that was getting 1.6, 1.7 30 years ago recently got around 64,000. We have something, the Forest Service has something called the Stewardship Program, which my friend Bruce Westerman sees is working well in Arkansas. However, it is not working well in East Texas. And in fact, I guess if a stewardship program spends money on a project that greatly helps the surrounding area, that's great. But when it appears to be used just to hide revenue and enable the Forest Service not to give 25% to the local government and not to use it in a way that the local government can even figure out how they're using it, it's not helpful. And especially when the government, the local government, and the schools are in such trouble. I think we ought to go to a situation where local government has a chance to opt in or out of the stewardship program. So if you got a situation like Bruce Westerman has, fine, but we would opt out listening to my counties. But on August 19th, we had Sheriff Robert Cartwright in San Augustine County had deputies that were pursuing, they knew they had probable cause. This guy was a drug dealer, and they were after him. They thought there were probably more, and he got into the national forest. They called the sheriff. He's trying to be a good neighbor. It was hot pursuit. They called the Forest Service. 4 hours later, kind of hard to be hot pursuit, get a call from a special agent in charge, not of the FBI. I didn't know we had a special agent in charge in the Forest Service. He tells the sheriff, we're going to try to get you an answer before long. It was days later. They let him know, we're still working on it. And then eventually, over a week later, a guy comes in, apparently very competent, and he goes into the land, still didn't let the deputy or the sheriff, and they find this massive marijuana project. And he tells the sheriff it's the most sophisticated crop he has ever seen being developed and grown. And the problem is, when you wait over a week and still don't let the sheriff or his deputies pursue criminals, you may find what they had to abandon. But the good news for the drug cartels is the Forest Service is so incompetent and so inept, we can just move over to another national forest because they'll take a week before they'll let anybody come after us. So they got the crop, they got all this sophisticated equipment. What they don't have is any of the criminals, because they no doubt have moved to another national forest so they can keep making money for the drug cartels. That's the story, and I regret the Forest Service can't be more competent in that area.
Further reserving, Chair recognizes Mr. Cook for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel for being here, and I've got to cool my jets also, because I'm from California, and we've had our issues with Forestry Service and BLM, and I'm at my age, I don't have time to wait for. It's been a problem, and a lot of it is I'm not going to beat up on it. A lot of it is just perceptions. I'm very close to the off-road vehicle. That is a sport which has grown tremendously. It's an economic engine, and go on and on and on. And compounded with the fact California is extremely sensitive to forest fires. On how permitting and everything else, whether we have to have more intention so that we get that done rapidly, and whether if we're creating off-road vehicles at the same time, we're going to look at fire breaks and how far they should be, and we cannot ignore what has happened in the past. And as a graduate of the Don Young Sensitivity School, I'm trying to keep my cool, but I think a lot of people are just frustrated. You're under the gun right now. A lot of it is not your fault. Now, years ago, when I was fighting with the Marine Corps over the boundary levels, I thought they were I spent 26 years in the Marine Corps. Years ago, I was probably fighting against the same people that I represent. So all I'm saying is I think Congress is very, very sensitive to some of these issues. And I appreciate you being here. You must say, oh boy, we're going to have a hearing today. But I wish we had more of our colleagues here. I know it's busy, we're all overwhelmed and everything else, but we almost need more of these to address this issue. Forest fires are not going to go away in California, off-roading, earthquakes, and go on and on and on. But whether yes, I am very sensitive to bureaucracy, and I'm a big believer in deadlines and what have you. And if you're missing deadlines, go back and say, we don't have enough staff. If you want us to do this, we need X amount of people, and outline it in, Public Administration 101, where we need the staff on this. So I'm getting a little excited about this, obviously, but you're, particularly the folks that we have here, you're so important to my state. 80% of my district, federal land. I have Death Valley, and I have Mount Whitney, the lowest point in the continental United States, the highest point in the continental United States. I don't want Don Young mad at me anymore. It's every other day. But these are issues that you're probably going to have more hearings. And I had some questions, but I'm running out of time. And it's like Los Angeles Water and Power. God, I got the tribe outside. They've been horrible over the last how many years? Let's watch a movie with Jack Nicholson, and I don't want to get after them because I'm only going to have one fight a day. And as I said, Don Young will revoke my degree that he gave me for sensitivity. But please, we've got to change this because the off-roading, public area, it's been discovered. Years ago, the Death Valley, you would have the Germans and the Japanese tourists that will be there, come in with a lot of money. Now, Americans, believe it or not, are going to the national parks more than ever. The traffic, all the side effects of it, and that's going to put additional pressure on you. And this is going to be very, very tough. But I think you see the political environment is such that if you have suggestions in terms of funding to help you, we can talk and everything else, but one of the best ways, I think you've got a bipartisan issue here where we can actually get support don't be shy, ask. I'm sorry, I probably talked too long. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. I think this is primarily to Ms. Baker and Mr. French. I had the privilege of spending the weekend in Redwood National and State Parks, Northern California. And first of all, the professionalism of the people that I met was truly impressive. And I had a number of takeaways from a very brief period of time, but one big takeaway was that whether you want to attribute it to climate change or any other reason, changes in the weather are changing uses and demands in our parks and national lands. For example, I spoke with a fire ecologist, and I asked him what he would want me to take back to Washington, and the answer was that the old fire season is no longer applicable. So in other words, it used to be, full-time employees for X period to X period, and then seasonal employees during that period. Then after that, you lay off all the seasonal employees. Well, fires don't follow that schedule anymore. Similarly, it occurred to me that as we talk about greater flexibility in the uses in our parks, we may well see changes in demand also in how we use our parks. And I'm wondering if, as we are trying to ease our permit loads so that we actually get people into the parks when they want to get in, where they want to get in, how they want to get in, within reasonable restrictions, are we also thinking about changes in seasonal use of our parks? Has that been part of the discussion?
Thank you for the question, sir. Certainly, the changing use of our public lands through increased interest that Mr. Cook mentioned of the American public and others, along with changes in patterns based on how the land is changing, are being taken in consideration when we make decisions about how we permit those lands and how we utilize them at the land use planning level, which is sort of the ultimate level for how we make decisions, all the way down to the individual permit-specific level.
Okay, Ms. French, anything to add?
Yeah, we are, and we're seeing the same trends. You know, I mentioned earlier about what's happened within our budget. This is the biggest driving factor. 15 years ago, 26% of our budget went to fire suppression. Now it's almost 60%. The direct effect of that is we have nearly 400,000 miles of roads, campgrounds that we can't keep up with the maintenance on, and those are the places and arteries that folks need to recreate. At the same time, we are having this greater pressure for using those facilities in longer periods of time. So for us, it's focusing on how do you get back to the basics? How do you provide the access to those places in the time frames that our customers are asking? It's a challenge.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, because it sounds like you're way ahead of it, but it just occurred to me that you're going to see a whole new demand profile that you need to adjust to in terms of the availability of permits, and so I wouldn't want us all to get caught off guard on that. And then, Ms. Childs, actually, your answer was an appropriate one for the question that the chair asked about what's the biggest challenge. One of the things I would have said, and I wonder if you can comment, is not just the availability of permits, but just a simple knowledge by many parts of our community that the parks are kind of available. I think there are many, many of us that love our parks, and we go into them all the time, and we know what the rules are, and we know when and kind of how to access them for whatever reason. But there are whole parts of our country that don't know that to start with. So I'm wondering whether, the conceived difficulty with permits, whether that's been dealt with from an outreach perspective, like, no, this is how you actually do this. I know many folks try very hard for that, but I just wonder whether enough people in our country even know how to get there.
Absolutely. We are working. We are piloting a program with Olympic National Park, and one of the things I do in outreach is an orientation fair, and I have rangers come and with materials on how to access the park, how to get from the city by bus and other modes of public transportation to the parks that are in Washington State. Also, the students, after they go home and they talk about the parks and where they've been, the families want to go. So I will get many calls and work with parents, like, my son wants to go to this place that you took him. How do I get there? How do I get to do this? So we provide that kind of education to people, yes.
Okay, well, I would definitely encourage that continued discussion, and if and as we can help on that, I'm sure that many of us believe that we should be doing that. Okay, my time is up. I thank the witnesses for your invaluable testimony. Thanks for spending the time with us here today and for your efforts on these bipartisan measures. And I thank the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.